Welcome back to Reflections Unfiltered. I'm John Harvey, here with Eden Valen, and today we're stepping into one of those subjects where the official story sounds terribly clean, and the real thing is not clean at all. We're told drug policy is scientific, rational, built for public safety. Very tidy, very civilized. And then you actually look at the landscape and you realize the categories are bizarre. Some substances are sold beside toothpaste and chewing gum. Others are treated like social contamination. And the dividing line often has less to do with measurable harm than with whether society feels comfortable around them.
Soft, amused. Yes. The pharmacy aisle is basically a moral poem pretending to be a risk model. We call one bottle medicine, another vice, another menace, and another wellness fraud. And the labels are often inherited, not earned. Culture gets there first. Science arrives later, usually carrying paperwork.
That's exactly it. If you grew up around governments and institutions, and I did, you get sensitive to the difference between a system that works and a system that performs itself. A lot of drug regulation feels performative. It signals virtue. It signals concern. It tells the public, we are protecting you. But if harm reduction were really the organizing principle, the rules would look very different.
Right. Because look at the familiar substances. Acetaminophen, ordinary, over-the-counter, utterly domesticated, causes about 56,000 emergency department visits, 2,600 hospitalizations, and 500 deaths annually in the US. It's also one of the leading causes of acute liver failure, and yet it sits there in bright packaging like a trustworthy suburban uncle.
And alcohol is the king of historical exemptions. Excessive use is associated with about 178,000 deaths per year in the United States. That's before you even get into accidents, violence, addiction, liver disease, family collapse, all the rest of it. Yet it's legal, advertised, ritualized, celebrated. People toast with it at weddings, while public health departments quietly count the bodies.
Tobacco lives in that same haunted neighborhood. Enormous harm, deep normalization, giant commercial infrastructure. Once a substance is woven into tax revenue, habit, identity, and adulthood theatre, society stops asking, is this dangerous? And starts asking, how do we manage the damage we've already agreed to tolerate?
Yes. And then along comes a newer or less respectable substance, something outside the mainstream medical or corporate channel, and suddenly the posture changes. The language gets apocalyptic. The concern may be partly justified, sure, but it's not applied evenly. That unevenness is the story.
So the core question for today is uncomfortable and, I think, unavoidable. Why does legality so often track familiarity, symbolism, and social class comfort more than actual relative harm? Why does approved danger get a pass while unapproved danger becomes a scandal?
And maybe even more pointedly, why do we trust systems that make those distinctions so inconsistently? Because once the public sees the contradiction, trust erodes. People begin to suspect, often correctly, that regulation is not just about health. It's about fear, optics, institutional habit, and a very old human impulse to divide pleasure into respectable and disreputable forms.
Which is another way of saying, the law is not only measuring toxicity, it is measuring who is allowed to seek relief, how, and under whose blessing.
So let's stay with the contradiction for a minute. If the principle were simply ban what causes serious harm, then the regime would come down much harder on alcohol, and frankly on common products like acetaminophen as well. But it doesn't, because the real principle is muddier than that. It's a blend of paternalism, precedent, lobbying, culture, and public relations. That's a terrible summary. Let me try again. The rules are not built fresh from evidence every morning. They're inherited. They're path-dependent.
Yes, once a substance is categorized a certain way, the category starts creating its own reality. Legal products accumulate standards, distribution channels, norms of use, more research access. Restricted or suspect products accumulate stigma, barriers to study, uncertainty, and headlines written in a tone of civic disgust. Then the system points at the mess it created and says, "See, we were right to worry."
Kratom is a very good pressure point here because it exposes the awkwardness. The FDA warns against its use, cites concerns like liver toxicity, seizures, and substance use disorder, and says there are no FDA-approved kratom products legally marketed as drugs or dietary supplements. A CDC analysis found 14,449 poison center exposure reports from 2015 to 2025, with 3,434 reports in 2025 alone, and 233 kratom-associated deaths over that period. Those are not trivial numbers.
No, and pretending otherwise would be silly. But the numbers also need interpretation. Most kratom-associated deaths involved multiple substances, and the specific contribution of kratom was often unclear. So the honest statement is not harmless plant, leave it alone, and it's not obvious public menace, burn it all down. The honest statement is, this is more complicated than the moral panic template allows.
Exactly. And that's where stigma rushes in to do the heavy lifting. Substances associated with self-medication, alternative healing, underground commerce, or people outside institutional trust get judged differently. A product sold by a multinational through respectable channels is often assumed legitimate until overwhelming evidence says otherwise. A plant associated with counterculture or informal relief gets presumed suspicious from the start.
Because public debate is not only afraid of chemical harm, it is afraid of intoxication, of dependence, of altered states, of pleasure that did not file a permit. Addiction, in particular, gets treated as more than a medical risk. It becomes a moral stain. A person isn't merely unwell or vulnerable. They are read as weak, disordered, irresponsible, contaminated by appetite.
And lawmakers know that, regulators know that. There is political value in looking stern about the wrong substances, especially the ones that carry social unease. You get to appear protective, decisive, morally awake. Meanwhile, the normalized substances, because they're already woven into social ritual and economics, receive a kind of grandfathered immunity.
Ah yes, the ancient doctrine of respectable intoxication. If it comes in a wine glass, in branded packaging, or under fluorescent pharmacy lighting, we call it choice. If it arrives through an unapproved cultural script, we call it danger. Same species of risk, very different costume.
Which is why people increasingly look at the whole thing and think, hang on, this isn't a coherent public health framework. It's part health policy, part morality play. And once people see that, the official rhetoric starts sounding less like guidance and more like theatre.
So if we strip away the moral costume, what would a more honest framework look like? Not utopian permissiveness, not chaos in a bottle, something grown up. You would regulate based on transparent criteria, dose-response risk, addiction liability, contamination risk, impairment profile, interaction potential, public burden, and whether quality control is actually feasible.
Yes, and you'd make distinctions that matter in the real world. Raw plant material versus concentrated extracts. Adult-informed use versus deceptive marketing. Manageable risk versus catastrophic hazard. You'd ask practical questions instead of symbolic ones. What harms are dose-dependent? What harms come from adulteration? What can labelling reduce? What requires tighter control? What can be monitored? That's how engineers think, frankly, and medicine ought to think that way more often.
It would also require admitting that prohibition is not some pure neutral act. When people continue seeking a substance after it is banned or heavily suppressed, the market usually goes underground. Quality control gets worse, adulteration becomes more likely, reliable information gets distorted, medical monitoring becomes harder. So the real choice is often not use versus non-use, it is regulated use versus murky use.
That's a critical point. Governments sometimes behave as if declaring something illegal removes it from reality. It doesn't. It often just pushes it beyond visibility, where both the user and the clinician know less, not more. And I'm not saying every substance should be freely available. Some compounds are acutely dangerous, highly dependence-forming, or too easily misused at scale. Aggressive control can be justified. But if you're going to control, do it consistently and explain the criteria.
Consistency is the missing virtue. Adults are apparently trusted to buy products with known lethal potential. Alcohol, acetaminophen, tobacco, in its own category of ruin, so long as the risks are culturally familiar. But adults are suddenly treated as helpless children around newer or morally suspect substances, even when the evidence base is mixed or still evolving. That contradiction is corrosive,
It weakens trust in institutions, because once people notice that legality does not map neatly onto danger, and danger does not map neatly onto prohibition, they stop believing the categories. And to be fair, they shouldn't blindly believe them. The boundaries are political and moral as well as scientific. Pretending otherwise only makes the hypocrisy louder.
So maybe the better question is not, does this substance offend our sensibilities? It's, what legal regime reduces harm most effectively while preserving transparency, autonomy, and room for reassessment? That's less theatrical, less righteous, more adult.
And probably more difficult, because it asks society to tolerate ambiguity. We're not very good at that. We prefer saints, sinners, safe things, bad things. But reality doesn't sort itself so neatly, and chemistry certainly doesn't care about our moral categories.
No, it does not, which means this conversation isn't going away, nor should it.
Agreed. We'll leave that tension right there for now. Eden, always a pleasure.
Likewise, John, stay curious, stay difficult.
And we'll see you next time on Reflections Unfiltered. Goodbye, Eden.
Goodbye, John.